Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Rita Panner here, filling in for Peter Credlin. Here's what's coming up tonight. A deeply troubling report that shows we're jeopardising our national security in the pursuit of net zero. It comes as green activists ramp up their lawfare to shut down vital energy projects. One of Australia's most notorious convicted terrorists, Abdul Nasir Ben Brika, has won his High Court bid to restore his Australian citizenship, but it was not a unanimous decision. I'll have more on that shortly. I'll speak with one of the journalists who yesterday sat through 43 minutes of absolute horror, footage of Hamas's terrorists deliberately slaughtering innocent civilians. This is the first time this horrific footage has been shown outside of Israel. Plus, police have had to remove anti-Israel protesters from Defence Minister Richard Marles's office. Some of these protesters even going as far to chain themselves up with bike locks. And it's been a while since we've heard from the perpetually outraged feminist Clementine Ford, but she is back to warn women about the evils of marriage.
My biggest issue with marriage is that I think that it's a fundamentally flawed institution that is built on the oppression of women. I mean, it's a pretty big issue.
But first, there's dumb, dangerously dumb, and then there's the sort of spectacular, unrestrained, self-sabotaging stupidity that only the modern left could pull off. And I'm going to bring you some examples of that in just a minute, not just from the US and the UK, but from right here in Australia. Indeed, I'd argue our examples are even worse. But before we get into that, today, the highest court in the land granted convicted terrorist Abdul Nasir Ben Brika a massive victory. The man who plotted large-scale terrorist attacks in Melbourne, including plans to inflict maximum carnage at a packed MCG, had his citizenship revoked by Peter Dutton back in 2020. The then Home Affairs Minister said Ben Brika would be sent back to Algeria once he was released from prison. He explained it doesn't matter who it is. If it's a person that's posing a significant terror risk to our country, then we will do whatever is possible within Australian law to protect Australians. Well, today, the High Court, in a majority decision, not a unanimous one, deemed that Ben Brika's rights were breached and that the separation of powers makes the punishment of criminal conduct exclusively judicial, even if the punishment is separated from the adjudication of that criminal guilt. So in other words, the court determined that the laws Peter Dutton operated under in cancelling this terrorist citizenship were not constitutional because they gave the minister powers that should only be exercised by the judiciary. But as I mentioned, this was not a unanimous decision. In a dissenting ruling, Justice Simon Stewart stated that cancellation of citizenship should be seen as recognition that an individual has, by their extreme conduct, separated themselves from the community and the country. He added there was no evidence before the court that Ben Brika has in any way renounced his commitment to violent jihad and hence to terrorism. Now, Ben Brika is currently behind bars, thank God, but he's eligible for release. He's being held on a continued detention order, but that is due to expire on December 23. Today, the Prime Minister was asked about this High Court ruling and he had this to say.
Quite clearly there was an issue with the former government's legislation, which is what this ruling relates to. But when it comes to the legal consequences, we'll seek advice for the ruling and respond appropriately.
Now to a familiar theme that is emerging at pro-Palestinian, or should that be anti-Israel, protests around the country, including one today at the offices of Defence Minister Richard Marles. It looks like the same neo-Marxist malcontents who are at every leftist rally, from BLM and those Invasion Day protests to global warming protests. The same anti-West, anti-capitalist, anti-colonialism grievance mongers who want to delegitimise modern Australia. The same activist class that's been emboldened by weak selective policing, particularly here in Victoria. There's also determination at these rallies to link the Palestinian cause with the supposed oppression of Indigenous Australians. We have heard speakers link the two groups repeatedly, and these protests often feature Aboriginal flags and extensive acknowledgement of country announcements. And those same familiar themes about colonialism, imperialism, stolen land, illegal settlements and genocide. They're repeated over and over again, with Israel and Australia condemned as barbaric apartheid states. And incredibly, in these pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli protests, there have been groups such as Queers for Palestine, Gays for Palestine, just incredible examples of leftist activists advocating for those who would have them locked up, bashed and even killed. Here are a few seconds of this lunacy on display from Europe to the US.
Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
It's little wonder that groups such as Queers for Palestine have been likened to chickens for KFC. On the weekend, an individual identifying as a black, queer, anti-Zionist Jew spoke at the Melbourne pro-Palestinian rally. And again, this speaker linked the Palestinian cause to the Indigenous one.
This colony's government has pledged its support for the Israel regime. This comes as no surprise. This colony is built upon white supremacy and settler colonialism. It bleeds out from its foundations. Of course, so-called Australia supports a racist, genocidal regime. This racist colony happily murders its own Indigenous people, our families. It happily dehumanises our men and boys the same way Palestinian men and boys are dehumanised, and sees our children as being just as expendable as it sees yours.
What can you say to that? How can you reason with that worldview? And how can you convince people who identify as queer and yet rail against Israel, the only country in the Middle East where they are afforded full rights? Let's head to Canberra now for tonight's political headlines with Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. The family of detained Australian writer Yang Hengjun fears he's being left to die in a Chinese prison due to medical negligence. Ahead of the Prime Minister's trip to Beijing, his two sons are pleading for a breakthrough and a second miracle after the release of Cheng Lei last month. Deputy Opposition Leader Susan Ley says the government must prioritise Dr Yang's release.
You cannot trade off silence on human rights for a ticket to Beijing. It is vital that the visit does not ignore the plight of Dr Yang.
I will be travelling with the Prime Minister as well to China, and I will ensure that whatever opportunity I have to make representations on Dr Young's behalf, I will do so.
Defence Minister Richard Marles says the trip is crucial amid heightened geopolitical tension across the world.
China is the source of our greatest security anxiety, and we've made that clear. But China is also our largest trading partner, and we do value a productive relationship with China.
Anthony Albanese has spoken to his Israeli counterpart, Benjamin Netanyahu, for the first time since Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel on October 7. The opposition had been heaping pressure on the Prime Minister to visit Israel on his way home from Washington as a sign of solidarity. Over the weekend, Peter Dutton questioned why Mr Albanese had failed to secure a phone call.
Mr Dutton, in the face of a crisis, in the face of Australians being caught in Gaza, in the face of this current conflict, in the face of the horrific attack by Hamas, in the face of Australians in Lebanon being requested by government, being called on by government to consider leaving. What does he want to do? He wants to find difference and play a bit of domestic politics.
The Albanese government says more than 11 million Australians will have better access to bulk billed GP visits.
Today is the day in which we triple the bulk billing incentive for Medicare.
The financial incentive goes to GPs willing to bill Medicare directly and not the patient. Health Minister Mark Butler believes this move will stop a long-standing shift away from the service.
Those that have moved away intend to return to bulk billing because this is a very big income boost for general practices that do bulk bill their patients.
Under this Albanese government, bulk billing is collapsing. It's under free fall, and I just don't have any confidence that today's announcement will reverse that.
Lots of news to get through tonight. Joining me with the latest is the Daily Telegraph's National Affairs Editor and my Outsiders co-host, James Morrow. James, let's jump right into it. In my editorial, I discussed the victory of convicted terrorist Abdul Nasser Benbrika in the High Court today. Benbrika has now had his Australian citizenship restored, and former Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton cancelled it after he was found guilty of planning these terror attacks in the early 2000s. This man is an ongoing risk, and it was noted in court that he's not abandoned his extremist views, James.
Well, yeah, I mean, and there's a mystery, Rita, to all of this here. Why would Benbrika want to stay in a country that he so clearly hates? I mean, he came here from Algeria, had all sorts of crazy Islamist beliefs here, wanted to be a terrorist, wanted to lead a terrorist cell and cause mayhem, death and destruction here on his adopted country. And yet, apparently, this place that he hates so much that he wants to commit terror attacks against its people and the nation, he still wants to stay and keep his citizenship. Rita, I simply do not get that. And I also, frankly, don't get what the High Court was talking about here, except for the fact that this seems to be a real case of sort of lawfare here in attempting to, use the courts to come at a situation that I think most people with common sense would say, no, we'll boot the guy.
Absolutely. Now to Sydney University, James, where administrators have had to shut down an event promoting a global intifada. The event, which was to be held by a socialist group today, you've covered this story. What is going on at our universities?
Well, Rita, sadly, the same thing that's been going on at so many of universities around the world, including the United States and the UK and here in Australia, of course, as well. Essentially, they wanted to have a meeting on campus at the university. They put up flyers around the place. And the flyers, Rita, were just incredible because not only did they call for a global intifada, which is a terrorist uprising against, oppression, whatever they're calling it this week, but it also, the poster had on it a picture of a bulldozer that was being used by Hamas to breach the security fence in Israel on October 7, staging the way for those horrific terrorist massacres. So this is what they were glorifying. Now, I found out about this yesterday afternoon. We published a story on it, contacted the university by about 8:30 last night. They informed me that the event was not going to go ahead. But I also hear that the university, there's problems with posters of hostages being torn down, as we've seen elsewhere around the world. So, Sydney University, our universities here, Rita, are not exempt to this sort of lunatic anti-Zionist pro-Hamas shilling that we're seeing around the world, pushed by the loony academic left.
Well, we're seeing the rotten fruit of the left's march through the institutions, and that started in academia, and we're seeing the results. Now, James, you wrote an op-ed in today's Telly on former ABC journalist Stan Grant, who admitted in a recent speech that the Voice wasn't a modest request, as the PM liked to claim. And we've also got the Yes campaign, which you noted, still blaming Peter Dutton, still blaming this supposed misinformation for their fairly significant loss. It was a fairly resounding loss.
Well, it was a really resounding loss. It was 60-40. We've got, I think, the final numbers in from the AEC today. They finally, I think, counted all the last little bits and pieces, rats and mice votes around the place, and it's going to be just about 60-40, which is absolutely massive, a resounding, thumping defeat. The interesting thing, though, about Stan Grant's speech this week, Rita, is that he, did a little journalism here as a journalist, and he scooped the world and found out that, in fact, it wasn't, a modest little request, as Anthony Albanese said, but in fact a monumental idea, this voice. So thank you, Stan Grant, for confirming everything that we've been saying, and we're called, peddlers of misinformation and panic and all sorts of things like that during the referendum campaign. Rita, you and I and others on this network. So we've been proven right. We've been vindicated by all of this. But, what the speech also reveals is that the yes camp, they're not going to go lightly on this. They're not going to say, oh, no, the people didn't want this. No, there's still going to be a huge effort through the courts, through other avenues, to try and get to the same place, which is treaty, which is co-sovereignty, which are all these bonkers academic ideas just by other means, since they couldn't get it at the ballot box.
Now to Melbourne, where Deputy Police Commissioner Neil Patterson has said that protesters cannot be stopped from unfurling hateful banners and performing anti-Semitic rallying cries. He implied that police would act only where there was a threat of violence or property damage. But James, we saw property damage in Melbourne CBD just Monday afternoon by these protesters. They defaced a government building and there were plenty of cops standing around and they declined to make any arrests that day.
Yeah, isn't that really interesting? And I mean, Rita, I think you and I are both pretty familiar with the scenes of the Melbourne police being somewhat more, shall we say, kinetic in their actions during COVID when people came out. And we have minutes and minutes of footage we could play, but I guess we won't do that now on that. But, it seems like the Melbourne police have gotten the New South Wales police disease, which is to avoid conflict with protesters on the Palestinian side. They just let them go and do what they want. It's entirely one-sided. I think it's actually quite cowardly because, they say, oh, well, it's all about safety. It's the same sort of thing with the guy here in Sydney who had his Israeli flag taken off and was arrested for his own good, for his own safety, briefly by the New South Wales police. And yet they let the pro-Palestinian marchers go down to the Opera House, set off flares, scream vile anti-Semitic, do horrible things to the Jews chants, and yet, oh, no, that was fine, we'll look at the footage, maybe we'll get somebody later. It's just tremendously disheartening, I think, because this means that all of these really radical Palestinian demonstrations, they're going to be shows of force, and they're going to be used by activists to show who actually has control, and it's not, Rita, the cops.
Well, it's mob rule. If they feel like making arrests, stepping in is going to antagonise a volatile crowd, then they decline to do that. But if they think that the crowd's lawful and will go along with this, then they step in. It's just completely bonkers, like you said. Now, last night, Foreign Minister Penny Wong tweeted this, saying she is deeply concerned at reports of ongoing settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. She also demanded that those responsible must be held accountable. How is this being received, James? We know that Benjamin Netanyahu isn't taking the Prime Minister's calls, and I don't think this is going to help matters.
No, and I mean, it's like, really, Rita, settler violence in the West Bank, this is the issue that Penny Wong is talking about? Not, Hamas's crimes, not Hamas, please release the hostages? None of this stuff here. No. It's all about, oh, no, it's those Israelis, it's those Jews acting up again. They're the ones causing all the trouble. I just think it sends the wrong message. I think Penny Wong has been very equivocal on this. And I think Labor has been, with a few exceptions, quite equivocal on this. We're seeing the same thing with the Democrats in the U.S. as well here. And I think it's to their shame. They're to their detriment.
Now, let's go to the US. At a Senate hearing in Washington, D.C. this week, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was interrupted by protesters who were screaming from Palestine to Mexico, all the walls have to go. Let's have a look. Oh, we don't have the grab. Imagine it. They were screaming stuff. James, tell me about this. Tell me about this disruption and the split in the Democrats when it comes to this crucial issue.
Yeah, well, this is something really, really interesting that we're seeing. It's the same thing playing out with Labor. There we had hearings, essentially kind of the equivalent of estimates hearings here in Australia. Anthony Blinken was testifying. We had those protesters come in. Oddly enough, those protesters were not dealt with, and it will not be dealt with as harshly as, say, the January 6th insurrectionists, who also interrupted proceedings on Capitol Hill, but that's another story for another night. This is, though, the great problem that the Democrats have. Labor has, too. They have a large Jewish constituency, but they also have a large Islamic constituency, more recent migrants. These migrants in the U.S., and one of the big Arab American groups has said, you have got to call for a ceasefire, Joe Biden, by 5 o'clock, I think, tomorrow, or we are going to pull our support from you for the upcoming Democratic campaign. Now, remember, in the U.S., you don't have to vote. So if those voters stay home, and in states where there's a big Arab and Muslim population, like Michigan and things like that, that could be the sort of thing that swings states one way or the other. So it's a huge domestic problem for Joe Biden, I think.
Oh, absolutely. He's got all sorts of problems. We've run out of time, James. So much more to discuss. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Don't go anywhere. Coming up, we'll go to London, where the ARC conference is charting a path forward for Western civilization. Plus, we'll speak to one of the journalists who yesterday sat through 43 minutes of absolute horror footage of Hamas terrorists slaughtering innocent civilians. Welcome back. Now, I want to go to the ARC conference in London, where over 1,500 centre-right thinkers from all over the world have come together to discuss the path forward for Western civilization. So many of our best and brightest are there, from John Howard to John Anderson to Dr. Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray and other international thinkers. Joining me from the conference tonight is Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Scott Hargraves. Scott, welcome. Now, before I ask for an update on the ARC conference, I want to discuss your new report released today titled Energy Security is National Security. It's been written by energy expert and University of Queensland Professor Stephen Wilson. What does the report recommend?
Thank you, Rita. We commissioned this report because we all understand that we need to take affordability seriously for ordinary people and for businesses. On the other side of the equation, there are those who are obsessed with net zero. The missing dimension in thinking about energy is energy security. We need a reliable system. And the other part of that is not just domestic reliability in our system, which can't be delivered by the kind of solar panels and wind farms that you're seeing on your screen, but it has to have the international dimension. It is vital to to national security that we get this right. We can't be reliant upon long supply chains for renewable energies. We need to be mindful of our obligations to our friends and allies who rely on our exports of coal, gas, and uranium. Australia has taken 25 years to basically stuff the energy system. And what this paper is doing is saying, here's a better framework where we put energy security front and centre. It's the power to be free and to do work. And until we get a focus on that, we're not going to get better outcomes in our energy system.
What hope do you have that this report will be read by someone like Chris Bowen? The man's an ideologue. He's a green ideologue, and he seems unmoved by logic and evidence.
Well, indeed, and we certainly present some of that logic and evidence ourselves. We take up the cudgels in our research on particular issues that are affecting it right now. But as I say, we've got to take a long view. It's taken a long time where Australia has gone down so many rabbit holes chasing this renewable energy nirvana. 82% renewables by 2030 is just completely unrealistic. We need better plans, better ways of thinking. So we have to take the long view and say, here's a better framework that can guide us over not just the next 6 months, but the next 5, 10, 20 years. And that's what we're trying to do with our ambition to establish a Centre for Energy Security, to really get a much better long-term focus, one which grounds us in an understanding of Australia's role in the world, where we can be an energy superpower, not a renewable energy superpower, an actual energy superpower, supplying much needed energy to the rest of the world, because whatever we're doing in Australia, the rest of the world is going to grow their energy demand as people move into the middle class all over the Asia Pacific region, around through Africa. It's not what we're doing in Australia that's going to affect the emissions profile. It's how it's going to work in the international context.
Now, Scott, you are currently in London for the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference. So many Australian leaders there, as well as notable international figures. Is there still hope for the West? That's something that author Konstantin Kisin gave a powerful speech about. Let's just have a quick listen.
But as I stand here today, after watching crowds openly celebrate mass murder on the streets of our cities, after watching the police spend more time debating Islamic theology on Twitter than enforcing the law, I'm starting to lose faith. I don't know how long our civilization will survive. For years now, many of us have been warning that the barbarians are at the gates. We were wrong. They're inside.
The barbarians are inside the gates. Do you agree, Scott?
Well, I think certainly what we've seen is a very strong effort at civilizational suicide in the West, as we've built an education system that's dedicated towards teaching generations of students that the West is uniquely sinful and responsible for all the ills in the world. But that was part of an electrifying speech by Kisin, who's just wonderful. But I would say the overall arc, if you'll forgive me, of the conference is that no matter how dark things get, we're here because we need to have faith. And Jordan Peterson, as you know, Rita, has that sort of air of a revival preacher, and he makes the point that no matter how dark things are, you have to choose the path of faith, hope, and courage. And whatever the situation we're in, we need to rearm ourselves, say that there is something unique in the West that's delivered unprecedented freedom and prosperity, and indeed people have flocked to it from all over the world. We have to have faith that we can choose a better path, and that's why so many Australians have come here to be part of restoring ourselves and developing that positive message. And people like Kisin are also going to take it to a new generation, and that's certainly one of the things that gives me hope that we can find our way out of this morass.
Scott Hargraves, thanks for your time this evening.
Thanks, Rita.
Now to a story that could be very confronting. I want to give that warning to viewers. As we spoke about last night, the Israeli embassy yesterday screened a graphic 43-minute video of the October 7 Hamas terror attacks. The video depicted the massacre of Israeli families, women, children, babies, some of whom were burnt beyond recognition. The screening was held to push back against claims by some journalists that the October 7 attacks were not as brutal as the IDF, the Israeli Defence Force, claimed. The screening was also held to demonstrate why it's so important that the Hamas terrorists are annihilated as Israel's ground invasion of Gaza intensifies. Joining me to discuss this is one of the journalists who was at that screening of that horrific footage, National Affairs Editor at The Australian, Joe Kelly. Joe, welcome to the program. Did you have any hesitation in attending this briefing, and why did you think it was important for you to see this footage?
Thanks, Rita. Good to be on the program. I did think carefully about attending this screening. Obviously, this is not the sort of footage that anybody would want to view. But at the end of the day, I thought it was important as a journalist who has covered parts of this story over the last few weeks. And the message from officials at the Israeli embassy also was that they felt there was an obligation to show journalists this footage in the interests of getting the truth out there, to reveal the true nature of the attack, the horrific attack on Israel on October 7, and really try and get the message out to the public about the Hamas brutality, and it is extremely disturbing. It's probably, well, certainly without a doubt, the most disturbing footage I've ever seen, Rita. That's for sure.
Well, tell us a little bit about what you saw and what you think will stay with you.
It was about a 40-minute video, 43 minutes to be exact. It started early in the morning with the infiltration into southern Israel and sort of documented events. The best way to describe it really is that it was really sort of an orgy of blood, fire and death. The most disturbing part about the footage, though, was that the Hamas terrorists were celebrating these killings. This was not a sort of the grim actions of sort of a soldier in wartime forced to take an enemy life to defend their country. This was indiscriminate killing of men, women, young children and babies, which was being celebrated by the Hamas terrorists. The most chilling part of this for me, I think, Rita, is that there were parts of the recovered footage where the Hamas terrorists were filming themselves and they're smiling. They have looks of joy on their faces. There's almost sort of a sense of hysteria or bloodlust to a lot of the footage that we saw. There's a few things that will stand out for me. One of them was this harrowing footage of a father and his two young children. And they were trying to escape. They were in their underwear. Obviously, they were not prepared or expecting anything like this. They ran out the back into another doorway to seek shelter. And in the footage that was shown to us, the Hamas terrorists threw a grenade into that doorway. The father was killed. The young children are dragged out of the doorway in their underwear, covered in blood. And then there's footage of the two children in the kitchen while the terrorists are going through the fridge. They're in distress. One of them asks where their mother is. They're talking about their father who's just been killed, and they're saying that they think they are going to die. One of them has lost sight in one of their eyes. And we asked the officials at the embassy what the fate of those children was. They simply don't know. But that's, I think, one of the things that will stay with me.
Oh, goodness me. I spoke to an Arab-Israeli activist, Yosef Haddad, last week, who was at the international briefing where 200 foreign press saw that same video. He begged the IDF to release the footage so the world can see what happened. Do you agree with that sentiment?
It's a tricky question. As I said, I think it was important to go as a journalist. I understand that there is naturally a reluctance for Israel to show this footage more widely. This footage was shown for the first time in Australia the other day. It's behind sort of a firewall, in the embassy. It's just so graphic. I think that's the problem with it, Rita. So we saw footage of charred bodies, burned beyond recognition, obviously the bodies of children that had been burnt. We saw the terrorists lighting dwellings on fire. There were images of babies that had been killed. There are spooky and haunting scenes captured from the body cam worn by some of the terrorists when they're going into the residences. Obviously, the Israelis have gone to their safe rooms to try and hide, and you can see mobile phones sitting out on tables where only moments before people would have been using them. We saw footage of some rooms where there were too many bodies to count that had been killed, the floors just drenched with blood. So, you know, that's the nature of the footage that we are talking about, and I understand why there would be a reluctance to produce that or release it more widely. I think what they need to do is to ensure that this is treated appropriately. I think one of the problems with releasing it more broadly is that it's very sensitive. You wouldn't want this footage to be misused or abused in any particular way. I think that's why they've chosen to show it to journalists who can report it accurately and put it in its proper context. So I think so far that strategy has been right.
Joe Kelly, thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks, Rita.
Coming up, an Australian feminist says marriage is built on the oppression of women, and she even compared wives to slaves. Plus, it's Wednesday. We'll be joined by wordsmith and broadcaster Kel Richards to get his take on the words of the week. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Now to a woman who gives feminism a bad name. Clementine Ford was given a platform on Channel 10's The Project to push her latest book, which says marriage is a patriarchal plot to oppress women.
My biggest issue with marriage is that I think that it's a fundamentally flawed institution that is built on the oppression of women. I mean, it's pretty big issue. I think that we would be much better as people focusing on how to make ourselves happy and how to live in accordance with our own values rather than thinking, well, I need to be married in order to be somebody in the world.
Okay, joining me to discuss this and much more is Shadow Minister for the Environment, Fisheries and Forestry, Jonathan Duniam, and Sky News host Caleb Bond. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Jono, I'll start with you. Is marriage a sham? Is it the whole institution a sham?
Well, as a participant in the institution, I don't think so. I mean, heaven forbid that there might actually be happy women out there who are happy in their marriage. That just couldn't possibly be the case at all, could it? But the last time I checked, marriage is very much an institution you can freely enter into and, as the law states, freely exit from. The idea that the left just want to unpick this thing, I think, is exposed by the question she was asked in that interview about what about relationships where people aren't married and are unhappy. And she says, well, yeah, you're probably right. We should target de facto relationships next. I mean, it's all about unpicking the family unit, not about the happiness of women.
Well, yes, the Marxists don't like the family unit for a number of reasons. Caleb, let me play you a little bit more of this interview.
And one of the chief complaints a lot of women have about their husbands is that they don't really feel like their husbands see them. All they are is kind of like a glorified all-in-one appliance for them.
Caleb, a glorified all-in-one appliance. That's how she says men see their wives. You're a young man, a bit too young for marriage, some would say, but what are your thoughts?
Yes, well, I haven't been married, but I dare say a lot of these things she's complaining about here would apply to in many relationships. It's got nothing to do with whether you're married or not. I mean, heck, if a man is looking at the woman he's with as an all-in-one appliance, quote unquote, and look, I've yet to find an all-in-one appliance. I mean, you know, someone who can do the cleaning and the dishes and all the household maintenance and fix the car. If they exist, let me know. I've yet to meet someone like that. It sounds like something you'd buy at Bunnings. But, you know, what she is carrying on with here is not about marriage at its core. As Jonathan was saying, it's about picking apart the whole idea of traditional male and female relationships. What she is getting at is that women, you know, don't need men and therefore men should not have relationships with women. Well, most people, when you get down to brass tacks, men need women and women need men if you're straight. It's as simple as that. And to break up the family unit because, oh, you know, marriage's an archaic concept. I mean, please, plenty of people are happily married. They don't need your interference, Clem.
Now, today, members of a Jewish activism group called Loud Jew Collective stormed the office of the Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles to protest Israel's invasion of Gaza. Let's have a look.
I don't fully get the Palestinian situation at the moment, but I somewhat get it, you know what I mean? Like, we're subjected to similar stuff here in Australia. Stop providing arms and resources to Israel that are only going to use to ethnically cleanse Palestinians.
Jono, these people call themselves anti-Zionists. They also describe themselves as a bunch of lefty Jews living on unceded Aboriginal lands. What do you make of this protest?
Well, I mean, it just demonstrates how out of touch and, frankly, abhorrent some attitudes out there by these people and others are. I mean, the fact is, and you just had Joe Kelly on your program outlining for your viewers the horrific things he's seen. Anthony Blinken, in his testimony to the US Senate, was outlining some of the most disgusting and horrific things that are being inflicted upon kids, families, all in the name of these terrorist acts being inflicted by Hamas. So to somehow try and describe Israel's self-defence and the actions they're taking to protect their people from these horrendous acts of terrorism as anything other than self-defence, I think just demonstrates how disgustingly out of touch these people are, and they should go out and get a reality check. Go and look at that footage that Joe Kelly was talking about.
Now, BHP Chairman Ken McKenzie has defended his company's decision to tip in $2 million to the Yes campaign for the Voice referendum, telling shareholders the mining giant had clear business reasons for the decision. Caleb, what sort of business reasons have they provided for spending their shareholders' money on this folly?
Yeah, well, what they have claimed, what Ken has claimed, is that BHP does a lot of its work on traditional Aboriginal lands, and so making a donation to the Yes campaign was their way to try and shore up connections with the Aboriginal community. I suspect it has a lot more to do with shoring up connections with the federal government than it does the Aboriginal community. It was essentially a $2 million handout to the Albanese government. That is what it was all about, because we of course know that companies like BHP, their businesses are threatened by the green policies of this government. So why wouldn't you do something to ingratiate yourself with them? And it ticks off all those other ESG points. So, you know, we wanted to really get in touch with the Aboriginal people? Please.
Now, Jono, there are demands from green groups for the Albanese government to include a climate trigger in its landmark overhaul of environmental laws. What's this all about?
Well, this is just the unabated creeping on of the left to make sure that we don't do anything productive in our country, that we drive all jobs and economic activity offshore. A climate trigger would mean we don't mine, we don't smelt, we don't manufacture a great many goods we need to have a functioning economy. The reality is, because Labor, who promised the world when it came to environmental law reform, have done nothing. It was so urgent in July of last year, where we didn't have a minute to spare to prevent new extinctions and to lock up pristine wilderness out there across the country. But here we are, 18 months on, the government haven't done a blasted thing. And both environmental groups and business leaders are all calling on the government to give us some clarity. The Greens, sadly, may get their way if they don't get their act together, but I'm hoping they will. I think we'll be let down, though.
Now, police in the UK have arrested a man in front of his distraught wife who's battling cancer, allegedly because he showed disapproval of Palestinian flags flying all the way along his local high street. Let's have a look.
The reasons why we did this is on the 17th of the 10th of 2023 on Bethel Green Road at 10:04. You were witnesses saying, obviously, people, why are they over here, etc. We let them into our country, etc.
So you?
Yeah, okay.
So you?
Farage's on the television.
Say that. Take him. Disgusting. He's a disgusting. Absolute. I'm a stage 4 cancer.
Just madness, gentlemen, really. We've seen the most horrific abuses happening in the streets, not just hate speech, people attacked, posters torn down, property damage, all sorts of unlawful behaviour that the cops have just watched on without action. And yet this man is allegedly arrested for allegedly saying things like, these people came to our country and why have they got those flags? I mean, really? Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this evening, and don't go anywhere because after the break, as always on a Wednesday evening, we'll be joined by Kel Richards for Words Matter. Welcome back. As always on a Wednesday night, I'm joined by Credlin regular wordsmith and broadcaster Kel Richards. Kel, welcome to the program. William from Williamstown, where else would a William live, writes, the news said an RBA rate rise is odds on. Why do we say odds on and not evens? Please explain.
It's not a bad question. It's quite interesting. The word odd came into English from an old Norwegian word. That means it was the Vikings who brought it to us. People forget that the Vikings didn't just raid England. They actually settled around Yorkshire. And they put lots of their words into our English, one of them this word odd, and it meant different. So if you were able to speak to a Viking and he said odd, it meant different. And it's meant that all the way through. So if someone or something is a bit different, we think it's odd. And that explains why it works in probability theory. So when you're talking about the difference between this happening and that happening, you're talking about the odds of this happening or that happening. So in probability theory, out of an old Viking word, we get odds, and that's where it comes from.
Now, there are calls for a truce in the Middle East. Can you tell us the origins of that word?
It's interesting. Truce comes from a source that looks, I think, a bit familiar. It actually comes, it's very closely related to the word truth. Both truce and truth come from the same Latin family of words. So, in other words, a truce means, a suspension of hostilities for a period of time, and it's based on both sides trusting each other. So, to have a truce, and it's connected to the word truth, both sides have to trust that the other side is telling the truth. So if there's going to be a truce between Israel and Hamas, both of them have to trust the other to be telling the truth. And that's where, in this particular situation, it may come unstuck. I mean, in other situations, it might work. But if you remember truce is related to truth, you'll see what the problem is. That's the hurdle that has to be got over. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, makes perfect sense. Now, leaders are talking about the axis of evil increasingly. We've got Russia, Iran, China, North Korea in the axis of evil. But what's the source of this expression?
Started in the Second World War. Nazi Germany and Italy were the original Axis powers. And the term was coined by Benito Mussolini in 1936 when he signed a political agreement with Hitler. He said, we are the Axis. Now, the word Axis is actually closely connected to the more familiar word axle. It means that around which everything else revolves. So who's saying, Hitler and I, we are the power brokers in the world. Everything revolves around us. That's why they called themselves the Axis. Japan joined them later, and they became the Axis powers or the Axis forces. Now, that was picked up in 2002 by George W. Bush in his State of the Nation address to the Congress. Yes. That's right. And he called the people who did 9/11 just 5 months earlier an axis of evil. The expression, we can credit George Bush with it, but it was actually written by a speechwriter, David Frum. If you've watched West Wing, he was the Sam Seaborn. He was the speechwriter, and he coined this expression, axis of evil. It deliberately to echo the kind of evil that the world was facing then, as being similar to the evil we faced in the Second World War. So axis of evil is a deliberate echo of the Second World War. And I think those four countries are an axis of evil. You are a marvel. You've told us so much. It's always a lesson and it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That's it for me. Thank you for your company. Don't go anywhere. The Bolt Report is up next.